The idea that happiness should be something that we're all pursuing, it's actually kind of oppressive if you think about it in a certain way. Because that version of happiness is very much, it's defined in certain ways that don't actually apply to a great many of us.
Maybe a goal of this project is to encourage audiences to think again about that term melancholy. Again, it's a term that we assume it's an affliction, but what else is there in that term? There's something quite provocative and potentially regenerative about deciding to be resolute in your sadness and not participate in a kind of forced happiness, a kind of forced optimism.
There were some challenges in putting together the show, and it was mostly in our attempts to encompass a lot of different practices, not only objects or video or film that can be easily projected in the gallery, but also performance practice and beer tastings or practices that just exist in text. A lot of the conversations that we had were around how to represent the breadth of these practices and give each of them equal footing.
Justine is a really extraordinary artist. She thinks about the body as an archive, as a living archive, probably the most important archive. And she also she looks very closely at the everyday and sees the dances that we do every day. And I think that is really what sets her apart.
In my work, I'll deal with things like eating dinner. What are the gestures of eating? What are the gestures of dining? I'll deal with how are we in liminal spaces? How are we in elevators? How are we in lobbies? And then I work to take these movements, distill them, and then sort of like return them to the audience, filtered through this like lens of choreography and like the dance. I'll be doing 101 performances of 100 gestures of resistance, which works out to about 6 to 7 hours. These gestures are taken from mostly photojournalism of people in protest or like organized protest or individual protest, but also how I've had to resist in my own body through my life. So some of these are like small things like smiling in moments where I didn't want to smile as a moment of safety, or turning my body, and instead of performing my personal gesture of resistance and these sort of archival like photographs of resistance, I'm looking to find the space between those two things. So I'll do 100 sort of illegible gestures. And for me, illegibility is something that is attached to privilege. Only certain bodies have the freedom to be illegible. I would argue that mine is not one of them, so I take that as a place of resistance.
And I'm very happy to welcome you to the opening of our latest exhibition, Unwilling, Exercises in Melancholy.
Rather to stay in the space of irresolution because of its potentiality.
Yeah, and I think you'll find with the works in the show that they are, as we mentioned in the introduction, a kind of constellation around the idea of melancholy. So there's different... I think one of my goals with this exhibition, and I guess in my wider practice and our wider practice generally, is to try and make space for things that maybe we haven't imagined yet. So the way that melancholy engages in the work of these artists, this sense of possibility, the sense that over time and over history and within our cultural practices, we have not been acknowledging or recognizing different ways of being in the world, that is super important to me, and if we can, in the visual arts and in the arts in general, start providing a space for people to start imagining what things might look like if we tried to do things differently, and that is a conduit and a platform for jumping off into all sorts of amazing ideas.
A propellant for another world.
Yeah, that to me is a very exciting possibility.